In a few moments, as the renewal of baptismal promises that we make with the parents and godparents, one of the statements is our profession of faith. And we say, do you believe that Jesus will come again to judge the living and the dead? And we say, I do. Jesus describes his return at the end of the world and all the signs that accompany it. And so he says, be able to interpret the signs of the times, to recognize when Christ is near, so that we're ready for his coming, so as not to be caught off guard, in other words. The judgment of Christ is described as the conduct of each one, and the secrets of hearts will be brought to light. Our attitude about our neighbor will reveal our acceptance or refusal of grace and divine love. In other words, based on our actions towards our neighbor, will determine how we have loved God. As Jesus said in the Gospels, whatever you did to the least of these, you did it to me. And St. John writes, how can we say we love God, whom we haven't seen, if we don't love our brother, whom we have seen? But Jesus says also, I have not come to condemn the world, but to save it. And so judgment is also the revealing of the good deeds and the actions that we have done, actions of love, and how they have benefited others and brought them to salvation. Oftentimes, though, in this profession of faith that says Jesus is the judge of the living and the dead, there's a temptation to say we don't want Jesus to be the judge, and that means we want to be ourselves the judge of other people, or even ourselves. But man looks at appearance while God looks into the heart. We don't really know what is in the hearts of others. We can know what is right and wrong, but we can't really know whether someone is in sin, because that involves what did they know and how free were they in deliberately choosing what they did. This is only something that God knows and the person. And so we're called to avoid rash judgment. As part of the 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Rash judgment is being convinced of the moral fault of others without sufficient evidence. In other words, making a judgment in our mind and assuming that they're guilty, that they've committed a sin. One example I can think of is there was a couple who were getting married and they sent out wedding invitations, and some of them got lost in the mail. And some of the people that were on the list were invited but didn't receive the invitation, and they became greatly offended. And when the couple tried to tell them, we did send an invitation, it must have been lost, they wouldn't believe it. They said, you did this deliberately to not invite us. And it caused a great division between them. That's a rash judgment. We don't really know the whole story, but we jump to conclusions. Rash judgment causes unjust injury to the reputation of others when we assume we know the reasons for the actions of others. We criticize them or make judgments about them in our mind, such as, this person cares more about money than me, or this person is upset with me because they didn't return my phone call or email, or this person hates me because they offered correction. These are all rash judgments. The words of Jesus are, do not judge lest you be judged, and the measure with which you measure others will be measured back to you. Before you remove the speck from your brother's eye, remove the beam from your own eye. Oftentimes, the judgments that we make in our mind flow out in the words that we say about others. And that leads us to the next one, which is detraction. In our words, revealing the faults of a person to someone who doesn't need to know it. It's a sin against the 8th commandment. It is another way of saying gossip. Sometimes people say, well, if it's not gossip because it's true, it is still gossip because it's harming the reputation of others to reveal their faults to someone. Unfortunately, many of our conversations center around gossip. This has to stop. Gossip harms the reputation of others. It takes from them their good name, which is even more valuable than their possessions. We wouldn't steal things from other people, but by gossiping we are stealing their reputation. Pope Francis says, we would never think of taking a stick and beating someone with it, but how much more spiritually harmful is it to run down others in our conversations? It causes great harm to them. There was the story of a woman who went to confession and confessed the sin of gossip. And the priest asked her, okay, go take a feather pillow and go to the top of the hill and open it up and let all the feathers blow away. So she did that and came back. And then he said, now go out and gather all those feathers back and put them in the pillow. And she said, that's impossible. And he said, just so is it impossible to take back the words that we've said about others that then spread from us to many others in conversations. St. Paul reminds us, in our conversations, only say the good things that people need to hear. So how can we combat gossip when we find ourselves in those situations? Maybe it's saying something positive about the person that is being criticized. Perhaps we can change the subject, talk about the Vikings or the Twins or something like that. Don't participate when someone wants to tell us something that is gossip. We may have to say it's not right to talk about others that way. Jesus' call to holiness begins in our heart. Why is there a temptation to gossip? Because sometimes there's a desire to lift ourselves up by pushing others down. We're thinking, at least I'm not as bad as that person. But instead, what is called for is godly sorrow, to recognize that we all fall into sins and we all need God's grace, to give the best possible interpretation to others' words, thoughts, and deeds. In other words, give them the benefit of the doubt, because that's what we would want God to do to us and others to do to us. St. Paul says, I do not even judge my own heart. The Lord is the judge of our souls. When we make judgments, it's often inaccurate. And so we turn that over back to the Lord and allow him to be the one who brings justice and mercy.